my father lived in Japan, so when I was growing up in New York City, he would take us for sushi, and we would have to go to these, very insular Japanese neighborhoods, and we would go in and often be the only non-Japanese people. I'm like 7 years old in the place, but we never dreamed there'd be a day where you get sushi, round the clock in supermarkets and convenience stores. And part of the problem is that's not what sushi is about. Like, people in Japan don't stop and pick up a bunch of rolls at the 7-Eleven for lunch. It's supposed to be something that's artisanal and special and you don't have every day. And the more you expect to eat that kind of food every day, there's two options. It's going to be crappy and cheap, or it's going to cost more money.
On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's event with Larry Olmsted, presenting his latest book, Real Food, Fake Food, Why You Don't Know What You're Eating and What You Can Do About It. Larry Olmsted writes the food column Great American Bites for USA Today and the travel and food column The Great Life for Forbes.com.
I did the Diane Rehm show on NPR about 2 weeks ago, and afterwards someone commented that my book and my appearance was part of a bigger plot to distract the public from Hillary's FBI probe. So I just want to make it clear, while the RNC is going on, there's a lot of politics in the wind, I'm not really involved in influencing the election, or that's not why I'm here tonight. I'm here to talk about real food and fake food, and I'm going to start by giving the example that I use a lot, because the first question I get in every interview is what is real food, fake food? So I like, especially since we're here in New England, not far from the water, to use the example of the lobster, the North Atlantic lobster, more commonly known as the Maine lobster if you're in Maine, here, the Massachusetts lobster, the Connecticut lobster, the New Hampshire lobster, depending, even Canadian lobster. When you get a Maine or North Atlantic lobster whole, comes out of the tank, especially if it's still alive, you know what it is, right? It's wiggling, maybe snapping. There's no substitute for it. You know what it looks like. Caribbean lobsters don't have any claws. It's a lobster. You really can't be fooled when you buy a whole Maine lobster. But then, once you take it out of its shell, you don't really know what happens. You order lobster ravioli or lobster bisque or lobster stew or lobster salad, and suddenly, is it lobster? Recent Inside Edition report suggested not often, not always. Some of those dishes contain some lobster, some contain no lobster. Really hard to tell by looking at your lobster bisque whether or not there's actually lobster in it. So to me, that's sort of the most obvious example. Lobster, real food. Chopped up lobster, maybe not real food. But that's overly simplistic, because the lobster isn't farmed. It's always wild caught. It's not fed a weird diet or raised on hormones or steroids or any of those things. When you get the lobster, it's a lobster. Then if you, say, substitute for the lobster a T-bone steak, you can still look at it and tell that it's a steak. It's not a pork chop, it's not a chicken, it's a steak. But suddenly you have all these other ancillary questions. Is it the grass-fed, drug-free steak the restaurant is telling me it is, or is it not? And you don't know, and again, there's a lot of issues with that. So that's sort of the real food, fake food conundrum. But I'm going to switch things up a little bit tonight, because I've been giving a lot of interviews, and everybody fixates on the fake food and some of these rather sensational statistics that are in my book that are true. The incredible percentage of the time you order red snapper or sushi and you don't get what you ordered. But when I was writing this book, and it's been a process of about 4 years from start to finish, at one point I was so appalled by some of the things I found that for a long time my working title was Fake Food, Real Food. But as you can see, it's now real food, fake food. And to me, that's a very important difference, even though it's all the same words, because really we should be celebrating the real foods. They're worth seeking out. They're really good. I didn't want to create, the number one comment I get is, I can't eat sushi anymore. You ruined sushi for me. And that really wasn't my intent. My intent was for people to say, wow, I really want to eat that because it sounds great. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about real food. And to me, there's no better place to start that discussion, same way I started in the book, by going to Parma in Italy, which is, to me, the sort of epicenter of great food production, especially Parmigiano-Reggiano, the king of cheese, which, as you can see, I chose for a wedge of that to be on the cover of the book. And when I went to I've been to Parma several times, but you go there and you see how these foods, and it's not just the cheese, that's where they make prosciutto di Parma, and a lot of the good balsamic vinegar comes from Modena next door, and Barilla, the biggest pasta maker, is there, and Parmalat, the biggest Italian agricultural product company of all, is there. It's a huge food town, and it's a great food town. It's off the radar for a lot of American tourists, but it's worth going to. And if you do go, you can tour any number of these. There's about 300 dairies that make Parmigiano-Reggiano. They all make it exactly the same way as they have for between 800 and 1,000 years, so it doesn't really matter which one you go to. They're not innovating or cutting corners or teching it up. In Parma, the cattle graze openly, and they graze on grass and wildflowers that are kept as intact as possible over time. They're not allowed to be replanted with new crops. They're not allowed to be fertilized. They're not allowed to use pesticides. The cattle themselves, they're not allowed to give them hormones or steroids or antibiotics, all of which are unfortunately pretty much norm in cattle here. And the result is an ultra-pure milk that's totally drug-free. And by law, the production of cheese in Parma has to begin within 2 hours of the cow being milked. So we're not talking about trucking this milk all around. Farmer milks the cows, typically takes it to his next door neighbor who makes the cheese. The process starts. It's super regulated. The only 3 ingredients you'll ever find in real Parmesan cheese are milk, which again is as pure milk as you can get, rennet, which is a natural enzyme that makes cheese form curds, and salt. And those are the only ingredients allowed by law in this cheese that has been made the same way for almost 1,000 years. So the result, and it's made in only one size, there's not a lot of creativity when it comes to making this cheese, but it's really, really good. And it's one of the only foods in the world that is every single piece of cheese made is tested before it's sold to the consumers. So there are inspectors who go around and they bang on and listen to and taste, if necessary, every single wheel of cheese that's made, and about 8% of that cheese is rejected in its finished form for not meeting the high standards of Parmigiano-Reggiano. So long story short, you buy a wedge of Parmigiano-Reggiano, you know exactly what you're getting in terms of both quality and taste. It's never bad. It's the only time you ever get cheese that's bad is if it's been poorly stored, it's too old when you buy it, the vendor mistake, not the manufacturers. So that to me is an example of a delicious, real food that is really worth seeking out. And then in our country, we have these sort of pale imitations of that. And I'm not going to get into that quite yet. We'll come back to that because we're staying positive right now. But Champagne is another example. I was in the Champagne region again about 3 weeks ago. It was my last trip before the book came out. I was there to do research for the book. Another product, I think everybody knows what Champagne is, right? It's the most famous wine in the world. You hear about it, you know, you christen ships with it, you toast great events, having kids, graduations, weddings, whatever it is. But not many people actually know that much about it. Again, it's a little overlooked by tourists. Most people who go to France to do wine travel go to Burgundy or the Loire Valley or someplace else. And Champagne is unlike any other wine that's made because it's sparkling, so it has a lot of extra steps. And frankly, if you visit wineries around the world, and I visit a lot of them, you've sort of been to one, you've been to all, because wine is generally made pretty much the same way, with the exception of Champagne. So it's this hopelessly romantic, overly protected process, even more strictly regulated than the Parmigiano-Reggiano cheese, because there's so many more steps. So in Champagne, the vineyard land is the most expensive in the world. It sells for about €1 million an acre, more than in Napa or Burgundy or any place else. But the government delineates which parts of the Champagne region you can grow grapes in based on the quality of the soil. And the total amount, I mean, if you're a farmer in Champagne, you want to grow grapes because they're the most expensive grapes in the world. But the total amount of the region that's allowed to be planted with grapes is about 1.5% of the real estate. So they grow more potatoes in Champagne than they do grapes. And then those grapes go into making champagne. And again, every step of this process is super regulated from start to finish. The aging, the kind of grapes you can use, the quality of the grapes. The government regulates the density of the grapes, meaning how many grapes you can get per vine, because the more you grow, the more diluted the flavor is. They have to be hand pruned. You need a certificate from the university to grow the grapes. They have to be hand picked so you don't damage them. And it goes on and on and on. And a lot of that seems really unnecessary. It's a very expensive way to make wine. Just the grapes required to make one bottle of what I would call real champagne cost between $7 and $10. You can buy a finished bottle of quote unquote champagne from California for $7 to $10. The real thing, in my opinion, that's just for the grapes. You haven't built a winery, you haven't crushed the grapes, you haven't fermented them, you haven't bought bottles, you haven't bought labels, you haven't aged them, you haven't stored them, you haven't shipped them, you haven't hired a winemaker, you haven't marketed them, you've borne none of those costs, and already the cost of your product is more than someone in America is knocking off your good name for. So that's sort of my problem with this area of fake food, and what both Parmigiano-Reggiano and Champagne have in common, along with wines from Napa and coffee from Kona and Vidalia onions from Georgia, are they're what are called geographically indicated products. And this is just one part of my book. A lot of it is about outright fraud, your honey being cut with corn syrup, and your seafood being substituted, there being no lobster in the ravioli. But in most of the interviews I've given, there hasn't been what I think is the focus on this geographic indication. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Because these products, in almost every case, predate the existence of the United States. They've been made this way since before we were a country, and they've been made very well, and they've been made very consistently. So I personally don't think it's right for us to make products labeled Parmesan cheese and Champagne and Roquefort cheese and Kobe beef and the many things that we do in this country, and then sell them to consumers as seemingly the real thing. Now this is legal fraud, because you're allowed to label your wine Champagne, and you're allowed to label your cheese Parmesan in the US. So this is just something I wanted to bring up tonight, because it's a little bit different from what people think of as food fraud, of actually substituting your foods or cutting them or diluting them. But it's an important part of my book, because at the end of the day, if you don't know what you're buying, you're still getting kind of ripped off, and you're losing out on some really good taste experience. So now we're going to move into the interactive part. I'm going to ask a question and ask you to raise your hands, but I'd like you to keep your hands up if you raise them, because it's a two-part quiz. So the first part is, how many people in this room have been to Italy? All right. Now, this is the tricky part. I want you to lower your hands if you like the food there, but keep them up if you thought it wasn't good. Oh, I've got a couple of people who don't like the food in Italy. That's very rare. Outliers, I think they're called, but that's okay. The reason I did that is because I get asked all the time as a travel writer. People say, I went to Italy and everything tasted so good, and even the most basic pasta with red sauce tasted so good. How come it's not that good here? Or how come I can't make that here? And I've given this a lot of thought, so I have an answer. So in Italy, and we're talking about geographically designated products, and Champagne's the most famous example, but there's thousands of them, these products that come from a place because of the terroir. Italy grows a tomato called the San Marzano tomato. Grows into volcanic soil from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Widely regarded as the best paste tomato in the world for making sauce. Chefs love it, Italians love it. You can buy it here. You can also not buy it here. You can also buy cans that say San Marzano tomatoes and have pictures of the Italian flag on them, and are neither San Marzano tomatoes nor tomatoes from Italy. So, but the good news is you can get them here. So that's a key ingredient. Pasta sauce or red sauce isn't extremely complicated. You've got your tomatoes, that's key. Usually you'd use a little bit of olive oil. If you saw 60 Minutes in February or read a lot of press, there's some issues with olive oil in this country. Again, just like the tomatoes, you can get really good olive oil. You can also get really poor quality olive oil. Then you're probably pretty good with the garlic, so we'll skip over that, especially if you use real garlic. And there's not that much more in tomato sauce. A lot of people will use some herbs. So maybe you cut up some fresh basil and put it in there, in which case you're good, or maybe you use some dried basil. When CBS did an investigation into dried spices, 50% of the samples they bought were cut, and if it was a green, if it was turmeric, it was cut with corn. If it was nutmeg, it was cut with pepper, and if it was a dried green spice like oregano or basil, it was cut with other vegetation, possibly weeds. So the Italians are homey people, my experience, but they don't, weed whack and then put it in your food. So people come back and they say, why does the tomato sauce taste so much better in Italy? Well, it's simple. They use real tomatoes, real olive oil, real herbs, real spices, and real Parmigiano-Reggiano cheese. Most of the tomato sauce that you get in this country is made with none of the above. And that's why it doesn't taste good. The good news is, once you know this, you can actually make really good red sauce here. You just have to buy the right things. And that's a big part of my book. At the end of each chapter, I give specific buying tips, how to buy olive oil, how to buy produce, how to buy seafood, how to buy whatever it is. Because it's important, because once you've tasted really good olive oil, it's really hard to have supermarket olive oil. I love olive oil. I use a lot of it at home. And there's a lot of ingredients or a lot of products in the books that I celebrate. I don't think everybody's going to run out tonight. And I have a chapter on Kobe beef because I use that as an example of something that's really, really misleading, but I don't expect everybody to run out tonight and buy Kobe beef. I do, however, hope that after looking at the book, you might think twice about the way you buy some of these other products, cheeses, olive oils, and then we got the regular product like seafood and meat and chicken that I cover that almost each of which in its own way is fraught with disaster. So tonight I've tried to focus a little bit more on the real food side of the equation, but most of the questions I get have to do with the fake food side of it. So I'm going to open up for some questions.
There's been a lot of discussion about olive oil. A lot of people are very emphatic that California olive oil is the best available olive oil. Can you answer the question about olive oil?
I think for sort of consistency and reliability, ease of purchase, California olive oil can be very good. I actually brought a bottle with me tonight in case anybody wanted to see it afterwards, because California created its own standard, its own seal called California Olive Oil Commission 100% Certified Extra Virgin, that the manufacturers have to submit samples to achieve this seal. And the reason I brought the bottle is because the seal is so small I can hardly read it. So I could tell you to look for it. You might look at it in a bottle and not even know it's there. So I brought an example because it's like the size of a pinhead. But that is a good seal to look for. That being said, I would not say California olive oil is the best. It's easy to shop for. Great olive oil all over the Mediterranean. Italy still makes great olive oil. The problem is it's very hard to get here. Italy, most olive oil you see in this country will be from Italy in some form. A lot of times that means bottled in Italy, which is different from made in Italy. Just means it was put in the bottle in Italy. Italy is the world's largest olive oil exporter. They're also the world's largest olive oil importer. So they buy a lot of olive oil and ship it abroad. And again, that's one of the reasons when you go to Italy, you often taste this great olive oil. It's harder to get here. Spain is the #1 olive oil producer in the world. There's lots of good Spanish olive oil. Greece, of course, makes great olive oil. Again, kind of hard to get. But what surprises a lot of people is if I had to buy olive oil tomorrow, and I had no information other than where it came from, I would buy olive oil from Australia. They have their own legal standards that are higher than the International Olive Commission, which is sort of the IOC in this Olympic year, which is the governing body for olive oil in most countries in the world, including all of Europe. Australia has the highest standards. It's a fairly new industry. It's very, very well done. Chile makes excellent olive oil. So again, if I was picking just based on where it's from. I would look at Australia, I would look at Chile, I would look at California, and European olive oils are great as long as you study it carefully.
Where do you find Australian olive oil?
Well, that's a good question. It's harder. It's getting more available in the United States. There's a really big brand called Cobram Estates, C-O-B-R-A-M, that probably is the top olive oil in Australia, and they do sell it here. It's harder to find, and they actually just bought up some groves in California, so now they make Cobram Estates in both Australia and California. Boulder Bend is another big Australian company, but it's hard to find. You'd only find it in a gourmet store.
I think with olive oil, though, so much of it is also the taste and the variety of tastes that the olives have based on where they're grown.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some olive oils that have a really peppery finish, and there are others that have a greener taste.
Sure.
So to say which is the best, don't you have to first know what flavor profile you want?
Absolutely, but in a lot of cases, all of those flavor profiles are available from a given country. So one of the problems, olive oil is similar to wine in that there's a lot of varieties of olives. However, with wine, it's fairly easy to tell what variety you're buying. You know, it's Merlot or whatever. There's problems with that too. That's a separate chapter. But olive oil very rarely says what variety of olive is used. So in a way, that's bad. In a way, it makes it easier for the consumer. You don't have to worry too much because you can't control it anyway. In some regions, in Tuscany, the olive oil is typically a blend of different olive varieties, whereas in, say, most of Spain, it's almost always one variety in a bottle. But I think a lot of times when people when they're used to that peppery or really fresh green taste and they don't get it, they're thinking that it's the variety, but it could be the same oil, it's old, it's stale, or it's just lower quality, because that, especially what they call the olive sting, which is that kind of little pleasant burn you get in the back of your throat, is an indicator of freshness in olive oil. And unfortunately, a lot of olive oil is sold too late. I was in New York last week and I went into a pretty well-known gourmet retail kitchen store that's a chain, and looked at the shelf, and they had a number of bottles of olive oil that were in the, say, $35 range, where the sell-by date on them was December 2017. The olive oil lasts longer based on its quality, but the best bottle of olive oil you can buy will not be expected to last more than a year. So, you know, they're selling this olive oil that if you go by that sell-by date, is not going to taste very fresh when you open it. I tell people, if you're going to look for a date on the bottle, and there's no regulation, so some olive oil has no dates, a lot of it has a use-by date, some of it has a bottled-on date, which is also useless because it could have come out of a tank, it's just when it was bottled. You want to look for the harvest date or pressed-on date, if they have it, ideally 6 to 9 months before, but not a lot of olive oil carries that date.
How did you decide to write this book?
Good question. I've been writing on food and travel topics for 20 plus years. I'm personally very interested in regional food, both here and abroad. If I go to the South, I eat shrimp and grits or barbecue. I like to eat food that has a sense of place. And I've been to Japan a few times, and I went to Japan about a dozen years ago, and I had the good fortune to try Kobe beef, which even in Japan is pretty rare. There's very little Kobe beef produced. And I don't want to say it's better than other beef, because that's a matter of taste, like the olive oil, but it's definitely different. It looks different, it tastes different. Nothing like our beef. Instantly recognizable once you've seen it and tasted it. And then I came back here, and I went to a few restaurants around the country that had Kobe beef on their menu, and I tried it, and in every case I said, this tastes nothing like what I remember. And then I looked into it, and I found that the importation of Japanese beef was banned by the USDA. So there was no Japanese beef in this country at all. That has changed. This was, I think, 4 years ago they relaxed the ban. But so all these restaurants are selling. Some are Kobe sliders and some are Kobe burgers, but steakhouses in New York selling $350 Kobe strip steaks, none of which come from Japan. And I wrote an article about that for Forbes. I called it "Food's Biggest Scam: Kobe Beef," and it got unprecedented response from my readers. You know, they comment a lot, but this was, off the charts. People felt really upset about this issue. And at the end of the day, as fake foods go, Kobe beef doesn't affect a whole lot of people compared to, say, coffee, or a lot of or seafood. And I just started to think, if this one issue intrigues people so much, what else is there? And I started to do a lot of research, and unfortunately, the answer is there's a lot. Food fraud is rampant. It's the Michigan State University, unfortunately, has a food fraud initiative. And they estimate it to be a $50 billion a year problem. The Grocery Manufacturers of America estimate 10% of the food that's commercially available in this country is adulterated in one form or another. And so, as I say, unless you're leaving the supermarket by the 8 item or less express lane, you've got a problem in your cart.
Are there particular chains that have more integrity in terms of selling things you can rely on more or not, or be more candid about what they're selling?
I think so, but it depends on the food. So I like Whole Foods for seafood in particular. Seafood is is definitely the most fraudulent category of food in this country, and also the most opaque. The chain of custody from when fish are caught to when they're served, they go through a lot of different distributors and middlemen. Over 90% of the seafood we consume in the United States is imported. The FDA is mandated by Congress to inspect 2% of that, and every year they fall woefully short of that. We're lucky if they inspect about 0.5% of the imported seafood, which is essentially almost all the seafood. So where you get your seafood is very important. Whole Foods, they spent a lot of money on traceability. They use third-party auditors. They send their own employees to Alaska in salmon season to tag the fish. So I think they do a really good job at that. They also sell fake Parmesan cheese. So it depends, what you're looking for, but that's one of the things I try to say, give answers to at the end of each chapter.
I really loved your description of how the Parmigiano-Reggiano is made, and that was just wonderful. And it made me wonder, what do you think are the factors in Italy, in Parma, that have sort of preserved that? Because it doesn't sound like highly profitable if the cows have to be treated just so, and the grass can't be, nothing can be done to the grass, and he has to go to his neighbor to make the cheese. You know what I mean? That this is not like this highly profitable model, it doesn't seem to me. So then, is it government subsidized at all? Is it a lot of government regulation? Like, what are the factors you think that has allowed them to keep doing that for 800 to 1,000 years, including into like the 20th century?
Well, the cheese is, it's one of the more valuable cheeses in the world. It's not the most expensive, but it can only be made in one size wheel, and that wheel weighs 86 pounds. So, if that's $20 a pound, suddenly you've got a pretty expensive chunk of cheese sitting on your table. But a lot of it is tradition, and I don't want to give away the whole Parma chapter, but it's not. I don't just talk about the cheese. The thing that I love about Parma is it's sort of a circle of life that's to some degree a closed system. So when they finish with the cheese making process, they have this leftover whey. That's the byproduct of making cheese. That in turn is fed to the pigs, from which they make the prosciutto di Parma. And one of the reasons why you can't just make prosciutto from any pig, because not every pig is reared on a diet of leftover world's greatest cheese. So, and then the whole way Parmigiano-Reggiano is aged longer than most cheeses, and this is done in these huge warehouses. And it would boggle your mind to see, because you go into this warehouse the size of a football field, and these shelves, and they're about that, they're just far enough apart to fit a wheel of cheese on its side, floor to ceiling, as far as you can see. And every one of those wheels has to be turned a couple of times a week because moisture condenses under it. So in the old days, guys climbed ladders and turned each 86-pound wheel on the ladder. Very dangerous job. Now they use little hydraulic robots that go up and down with little forklifts that go up and down the aisles and do it. But because the cheesemaker makes this cheese and then it sits around for an average of 20 months before they can sell it, they borrow money against their inventory from the bankers in Parma, and the warehouses are owned independently. And the guy who designs the robotic forklifts is in Parma. So this whole city revolves around the production of food, and everyone's interconnected. And it's just, I'm not a real new agey person or anything, but to see that, the banker and the warehouser and the cheesemaker and the guy who owns the cows are all mutually independent in a way that keeps the whole system flowing. It's an amazing.
If you could change one piece of legislation to maybe get rid of the fake, well, what would you change?
That's a really good question. I'm going to give you two because I can't do just one. I mean, one would just be more oversight of the seafood. It's incredibly lax and it's dangerous because a lot of these fish that are being substituted for what we think we're buying are raised in completely unsupervised farms in Southeast Asia with banned antibiotics or unapproved antibiotics, or for example, red snapper, which is the single most substituted fish you can buy. More than any other fish, when you see it on a menu, you're probably not going to get it. One scientist I talked to who's a leader in this field, I asked him for one tip, the world of fake food, he said, never order red snapper. So, and the number one substitute for red snapper is a fish called tilefish. It's on the FDA's do not eat list for pregnant women and sensitive diners because it's high in mercury. So the seafood fraud is an economic fraud and a health concern. And I wish, and the FDA is in charge of that, and I wish they would do more. The second thing that I didn't realize as much when I started out to do the book is restaurants. Restaurants are largely immune from labeling legislation and are more regulated at the state level. And the Tampa Bay Times just did a very big expose a couple of months ago in Florida of farm-to-table restaurants. You know, and all these claims you see on the menu, it's heirloom pork, or it's local fresh tomatoes, or it's wild-caught salmon, dry-aged beef, grass-fed beef, antibiotic-free, whatever it was. They looked at every restaurant that they had ever reviewed in the paper, and they found something wrong with every single one of them, their menus. And you can just make these claims, and no one holds you accountable. And some of them, you know, again, if you pay for dry-aged beef and you don't get it, maybe you're being cheated out of a little money and flavor. But in one case, a lot of the seafood, a lot of people make an effort to eat wild-caught seafood because they want to avoid the drugs, and then they sell you farms, so you're still getting them. But there was one that particularly offended me where there was a restaurant that specialized in veal schnitzel. And a lot of the people who choose to eat at this restaurant follow either Muslim or Jewish dietary law because you can eat veal. However, they were not serving veal. Their walk-in was full of frozen pork chops, and they'd been in business for quite some time and were unable to produce one receipt ever showing that they had ever bought any veal. So anyway, those would be the two things I would fix.
How much, as a consumer, how much is real food more expensive or is fake food more expensive?
Real food is more expensive for the most part, and I like it. There's counterfeit Rolexes. There aren't that many counterfeit Timexes. You are knocking off these foods because they're high quality. That being said, there are some exceptions, especially with the staples, where it's more adulteration than substitution. And again, coming back to my favorite Parmigiano-Reggiano cheese, a lot of the domestic cheeses actually sell for more. So that's an example where the real thing costs you less than a lower quality imitation. But staples, coffee, honey, juice are always in the top 10 of the most adulterated foods in the world. And sometimes it's a little thing. Like one of the general tips I give is buy food, like the lobster I talked about at the beginning, buy foods as close as you can to the whole form. If you know what a red snapper looks like and you buy a whole red snapper, it's a lot harder to get ripped off. But coffee is an example where you buy whole beans and you're good in the sense that you're definitely going to get coffee. Nothing else looks like a coffee bean. But when there's 10 bins of coffee and one of them is Jamaican Blue Mountain and it's $30 and the next one's $20, the next one's $9, they all look exactly the same. There's a big potential for fraud there. The former chairman of the FDA told me, if you have two foods that look the same and one costs more than the other, you're going to have fraud every single time. It's simple economics. Somebody's going to try to sell you the coffee for more than it's worth.
So my question is more about the monopoly practices of some of the real foods. And maybe it's because I would not know the difference between most champagne and cava and whatever the other
Prosecco or
some I might notice the difference, but a lot of them I don't, and it's because of the legislation protecting champagne and protecting the name that these other lovely drinks can't be called champagne.
Right, that's true. Well, but
It's monopolistic.
it is, but they did invent it, right? So I would say Apple is a monopoly, right? The US government would be pretty pissed off if the people in France started making Apple iPhones that were different and selling them. We go to great lengths to protect our intellectual property when it comes to software, videos, music.
I don't think it's the same.
Really? Okay, well, I do, but and I think that in this case, again, the big difference is there's a very precise structure in place that defines when you buy a bottle of French champagne or Parmigiano-Reggiano cheese or any of these products, and the U.S. has geographically designated products as well, you know exactly what you're getting, both in terms of quality and in terms of ingredients. And you know that in the cheese you're not getting any drugs, and in the champagne you're getting pre-qualified quality of grapes and a certain amount of aging that makes the product better. When you buy it in other places, and there are 6 countries in the world in which you can buy champagne that is not made in France. It's a heralded group. It's Argentina, Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, the Ukraine, and the United States of America. You have literally no idea what you're getting. I don't think it's illegally even required that it have bubbles in it. Certainly there's no regulation on the grapes used at all, the variety of them, the aging. Some of the domestic sparkling wine, well, I mean, the champagne and most sparkling wines get their bubbles from what's called secondary fermentation. They add yeast and sugar, but you can pump in a hose and pump in carbon dioxide just like you do make Coca-Cola. And there are definitely sparkling winemakers in the US that do that. Buy cheap still wine, pump some gas into it, slap a label on it, ship it. It saves you a lot of money in production. So I mean, yeah, it's a monopoly, but to me, I look at it, it's a trademark. It's like a drug or anything else.
Will you continue with your discussion of coffee? I buy a lot of coffee.
The good news about coffee, like I said, is if you buy it in a whole bean, you know it's coffee. And if you like it, you know you like it. So the worst sort of downside here is maybe you're buying that $30 a pound Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee, and maybe it's not really Jamaican Blue Mountain. But if you're happy with it, it's the least of the problems in this book. You know, you're getting coffee and you like the taste, and maybe you could pay a little bit less for it. The bigger problem is if you buy ground coffee, and I don't view it as that big a problem because most people, there's been a big revolution in our coffee culture, and most people who like coffee either buy beans or at least maybe grind the beans at the supermarket where you pour it into the machine and you know what you poured in. On the other hand, if you buy canned, bagged, pre-ground coffee, it's got a long, rich history of adulteration going back hundreds of years, and everything from ground acorns to roasted corn to sawdust.
What about K-Cups?
Well, they're made in Vermont, which is where I live, so I can't really criticize them. But I do personally. I don't like the amount of waste it generates. That's why I don't use the K-Cups. But I think Green Mountain Coffee does a pretty good job on their sourcing, which owns it. I guess there's other companies make them now, but they're like the official K-Cup company.
I hate to change the subject away from coffee, but it's part of coffee. What about organic? Did you come across organic foods? Is there a distinction that you can make real food, fake food, when considering the organic label that we see so often?
There is. It again depends on the food. So I think I don't have real high expectations of government regulation, but I think that the organic standards, they've actually done a pretty good job. People who are really into this topic will say that there's still some fertilizer that they use that they shouldn't be able to use, but compared to everything else, it's a pretty good standard. But it's more important on some foods than others. So I talk about it in the book. A lot of people don't know that, but people complain. And I found this out in all topics. When people say, oh, chicken doesn't taste like it used to, or, especially like grandmothers always complain about this, there's usually a reason. And one of the things a lot of people complain about is the taste of supermarket tomatoes. They're rock hard, they're red, but they don't seem ripe, and no matter how long you have them, they never seem ripe. And the reason is because almost all of the tomatoes consumed in the United States are picked green. And in general with produce, if you're a farmer, you want to get whatever the plant is, or whatever the fruit or vegetable is, off your plant as quickly as possible, because every day it stays out there, a bug could eat it, it could get hit by hail, it could fall off. You have risk when it's growing, you don't have any risk once you've picked it and sold it. So the vast majority of tomatoes are picked green, sent to food distribution warehouses for your local supermarket. When the supermarket runs low on tomatoes, they call the warehouse. The warehouse hits those green tomatoes with gas. The gas forces a reddening change in the tomato, which is different from a ripening change. That ripens it slightly. The gas isn't dangerous, that's a good thing, but the result is you're basically getting a kind of green tomato that's red. And so when I buy, and it's the same for bananas. The difference is you can get ripe tomatoes in the United States, you cannot get a ripe banana. I talked to one scientist who said, I don't know a single person who's ever tasted a tree ripened banana, and he had, and I asked him what it was like, and he said it's probably too banana-y for most people. But, so I buy organic tomatoes. I don't always splurge on oranges because to me there's more benefit in the tomato. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but yes, and one caveat being that when the USDA did make the organic standards, they have them for produce and they have them for meat, and meat's actually probably a little more important because it covers a lot of the drug angles, but there is no organic standard for seafood. And the general rule of thumb with the USDA and the FDA, as we see with natural right now, and we saw with organic for a long time, and we see with a lot of free-range, grass-fed, humanely raised, green-fed, all these terms, if they haven't defined it, you're free to use it however you want. So you will see organic seafood labeled, but it doesn't mean anything.
Do you deal with or see anything about how much of this supposedly hormone-free milk is actually raised without hormones? Because I know farmers in Vermont, and mostly they say when you decide you're going to sell it that way, you take the vial of the hormone and keep it out of the barn and keep it up in the house so they don't find it. But is it that prevalent? Because these guys suggest that there's none of this being sold as hormone-free.
By law, when the cows are given drugs, especially with, well, I think the hormone, you know, I'm not as sure with milk. I know with the beef cattle, you definitely have hormones in it. But with like the antibiotics in the milk, if they give the cow antibiotics for medical reasons, they're supposed to keep it out of the production chain for a certain amount of time until it clears its system. However, when tested, the amount of time that they use is not enough. There's often residual, but I don't know about the hormones in milk particularly.
So you talked about some of the like kind of dangers, the risks associated with fake food, and you talked about the cost of real food being more. Can you talk at all about like kind of in general accessibility of real food for populations that maybe have trouble affording it?
Well, I mean, it costs more to eat well, there's no doubt, and whatever your definition of eating well is. And especially, I try not to pass judgments in terms of what you should or should not eat. You know, I don't say you should be vegan, and especially some of the hot button issues like local, the carbon footprint of the food, that kind of thing. Because ultimately, everybody's got to make their own decision how important that is. My concern is that if you decide, I want to eat drug-free, grass-fed beef because I think it's better to me, then you at least get that when you pay for it. Whether you make that decision or not, that's more up to you. But I do talk about sort of some strategies to make your money go further. I mean, I love beef. I've always loved beef. I try to eat less. Probably my biggest takeaway from writing this book is I don't want a bunch of drugs in my animal protein, whether it's beef or pork or chicken or seafood. I don't want antibiotics and hormones and steroids that I'm not prescribed. So I eat beef less because the beef I buy now is more expensive. But I look at it as, well, you don't have to eat beef every day. And a lot of these problems, I think, do come from our society sort of getting used to having things all the time. I mean, it goes back to the idea that you ate Brussels sprouts in the fall and asparagus in the spring, and now we want to have those things all year round. So they come from South America, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they're not going to be as fresh. And if you care about how far they were shipped. And when I was growing up, for example, shrimp was considered a luxury item. I mean, I remember you used to go to like the steakhouse, you know, go to the Palm or Ruth's Chris or something, and you'd get a shrimp cocktail, and that would be like a birthday, you know, splurge. There was never a notion that you would expect to get all you could eat popcorn shrimp for $9.99, and it's the same with sushi. Like, you know, my father lived in Japan, so when I was growing up in New York City, he would take us for sushi, and we would have to go to these very insular Japanese neighborhoods, and we would go in and often be the only non-Japanese people. I'm like 7 years old in the place, but we never dreamed there'd be a day where you get sushi, round the clock in supermarkets and convenience stores. And part of the problem is that's not what sushi is about. Like, people in Japan don't stop and pick up a bunch of rolls at the 7-Eleven for lunch. It's supposed to be something that's artisanal and special and you don't have every day. And the more you expect to eat that kind of food every day, there's two options. It's going to be crappy and cheap, or it's going to cost more money.
Can you go back to bananas a second? I know what I'm about to say is going to make me sound crazy, but about a year or two ago, I swear I thought they were spray painting the bananas. Because I kept looking at them, and I love my bananas really green, and I kept feeling them, and I'm like, they look green, but they don't feel green. And I'm like, are they painting the bananas? Is there?
You meant they were riper than you thought. That's unusual.
Yeah, it was just weird, and I remember going, this doesn't seem right, what I'm feeling and seeing. So I know that kind of is crazy.
Yeah, I've never heard of them spray painting it, but I knew. One thing with the gas is, right, they picked that whole thing of bananas green, and again, it sits in the warehouse, the distributor. And then, because when you actually buy bananas, and I buy a lot of bananas, and just live with what I do buy the organic because it takes the gas, all right. But if you buy like 6 bananas, and usually when you pick them in the store, sort of 3 are yellow and 3 are green, right? And then the next day they're all yellow in your house, or 2 days later, and you're like, how did that happen so fast? It's not natural, especially because they've already been sitting in the warehouse for weeks.
So, I don't know anything about all this stuff. I'm asking a question. Consumer reports and these kind of things are about a lot of products and stuff. But it sounds like you talk about this olive oil industry group and the governments and industry group. Is there any movement to just finally end all this? There's some consumer based, not new agey, new generation Ralph Nader kind of stuff where just everyone in the audience here across every one of your book gets together, and then the consumers who eat cheese or just get together and say, we're going to have the kosher people have their own thing, they're very serious about it, the rabbis do it, and it's not no non-rabbi is going to do the kosher certification. Just is there any movements out there where a bunch of consumers, a lot of people my parents' age in the audience who spend a lot of money, like he says, I spend a lot of money on coffee and might be retired, and they get together and say, we're going to be the official stamp, and we're all consumers of this, and we believe it, and then you can trust it, something like that?
No, but there are for specific industries. Again, the food supply is so diverse. So in seafood, you have a lot of these third-party, a lot of them are nonprofits that are certifying, and so, there's the Marine Stewardship Council, their check mark. It looks like...
Is that industry, sir, or is that consumers?
No, that's
industry members or consumers?
I don't think it's industry. I think it's a nonprofit, but it's the one that the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which does the Sea Watch, which is sort of the standards of what's acceptable to eat based on sustainability and practices that they use to evaluate wild-caught fish. Then there's a separate one, the Global Aquaculture Council for farmed fish, because they each have their own specialty. So, there are certain either designations or seals that people can look for.
They do a good job?
So the Marine Stewardship Council, I talked to one of probably the leading seafood chefs in America, Rick Moonen, who's written cookbooks and has a restaurant in Vegas, is very well known for being on top of seafood sustainability, and he told me that's the one standard he trusts 100%, the Marine Stewardship Council. But again, it's different. He's a chef, he's buying it from a distributor. When you go into a restaurant, they could tell you, oh yeah, our fish is Marine Stewardship Council certified, but you never see anything. So it's at some point, with restaurants in particular, I suggest people ask a lot of questions, and especially the more expensive or esoteric the product, right? If it's wild-caught salmon or it's Wagyu beef or whatever it is, you can't call Cisco and have them drop off, this with your bell peppers. So you have a distributor that you use. And I like to ask in a restaurant, where do you get your seafood? And if they can't answer instantly, that's a red flag, because if they're selling good seafood, they need to know where they got it from.
I was just going to add something about Italy, because I was in Cinque Terre many years ago as they were unloading frozen seafood from Thailand into some of the restaurants, and that was what they were serving as food in Cinque Terre.
That's unfortunate,
so
but
just us.
oh no, you know, more than half of the seafood now in the world is produced in farms. And when I say that, I shouldn't say aquaculture is not a bad thing. I don't mean to paint it with a broad brush. It's bad for salmon, it's bad for shrimp, it's fine for a lot of freshwater fish. You know, there's good aquaculture and bad aquaculture, but a lot of it, especially, is done in less labor cost countries for the most part. In Southeast Asia, and Thailand, for example, is the #1 producer of shrimp for the United States.
I have a two-part question, well, two questions I could slip under the wire. You told us we should go to Parma for Parmesan. Could you elaborate on Parmesan versus Parmigiano-Reggiano? And in addition to going to Parma for cheese and Champagne for France for champagne, was there any place else you'd recommend for sampling real food as a destination?
Sure, both very good questions. And the first one in particular, this is one that elicits a lot of confusion. People are like, well, it's not Parmigiano-Reggiano, it's Parmesan, like the craft stuff, or a lot, Wisconsin or Argentina, whatever, you can buy it readily here. But the answer is yes, they are exactly the same thing, because just as how should I put this? So in Italy, they don't call their country Italy. They call it Italia. That's the name of the country, right? We call it Italy because it's been translated. They call Rome Roma, and they call Florence Firenze. These are these English words for it. Parmesan is the English translation of Parmigiano-Reggiano cheese, and it was introduced by the British, again, before the United States existed. So it has been the literal translation of that name of that cheese in English for hundreds of years. So there are people who say, well, if you buy Parmesan, you should know. Well, no, you shouldn't know, because it means exactly the same thing. And if you do believe there's a difference, then you have to accept that, like, made in Italy doesn't mean made in Italy, because it's a different word from what Italy really is. So that's number one. And then number two, places. So I really like to eat seafood on the Gulf Coast, like Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. You've got arguably the best wild-caught commercial shrimp in the world. You've got oysters, a lot of really good fish coming out of the Gulf. And that's a little easier than, say, Alaska, where they have the most incredible seafood. The problem is we have wonderful seafood in the U.S., so wonderful that everybody wants it. So we export a lot of it for top dollar and replace it with much cheaper imports. But if you go to Alaska, it's one of those places like Parma where the people, they don't know how good they have it. They're just like, every time they go out to eat, the seafood is so good, they don't even know it's good. You know, I was in Alaska for a week, and I don't even eat that much seafood, but I had it every chance I could, and every time you ate it, it was like, wow, this is the best fish I ever had. So,
thank you.
You're welcome.
So it's the first human-procured recording from the sounds of space. And it was the collision of two black holes 1.3 billion years ago. One of them was 29 times the mass of the sun. One of them was about 35 times the mass of the sun. When they collided, we only saw the final 1/5 of a second. I shouldn't say saw, recorded the final 1/5 of a second. It was too quiet before that final moment. So it's like mallets on a drum banging on space-time, and not until they're going near the speed of light, each one a couple hundred kilometers across, and they collide, was it loud enough that even for these remarkably sensitive instruments to record.